The atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace has never been more suffocating than it is tonight. For months, the world watched as a father's love battled a king's duty, a silent war waged in the shadows of tradition and betrayal. But the era of quiet diplomacy and soft-spoken pleas is officially over. King Charles III, a man who spent 70 years waiting to lead, has finally delivered a verdict so cold, so final, that it has effectively shattered the last remaining bridge between London and Montecito. This isn't just about a family feud. This is about the survival of an ancient institution that has reached its breaking point. The news arrived not as a public statement, but as a seismic shift in the very foundations of the monarchy. Behind the heavy, gilded doors of the palace, the king stood side by side with his heir, Prince William, to issue a final warning that no one, least of all Prince Harry, saw coming. The decree is clear. Harry is banned from the coronation. It is a devastating blow, a public exile that marks the moment the mask of beloved family finally slipped to reveal the cold steel of the crown. For Harry, this was the ultimate gamble. He believed that the blood bond would always be his get-out-of-jail-free card, a permanent pass to challenge the system and still expect a seat at the table. He thought he could write the memoir, film the documentary, and hurl accusations from across the Atlantic, only to fly back and claim his place in the history books when the crowns were placed on heads. He was wrong. The decision was neither emotional nor rushed. It was a strategic execution of power. Inside the palace, sources describe a king who has been pushed to the absolute edge by years of erosion, leaks, and what he now views as a relentless assault on the dignity of the throne. But why now? What was the final straw that made a father turn his back on his own son during the most significant moment of his life? Insiders speak of a private revelation, a moment where the fab for dream was finally laid to rest in favor of institutional integrity. William, the man who will one day sit on that same throne, has been the architect of this firm boundary, convincing his father that reconciliation without accountability is nothing more than a recipe for total collapse. The message to the world is undeniable. The crown does not just manage feelings, it manages perception, and it will no longer allow Harry's drama to be the headline of Charles's legacy. This is the night the palace blinked, and Harry was the one who lost everything. To understand the weight of this ban, one must look not at the king, but at the man standing directly behind him. Prince William, the Prince of Wales, has emerged as the true architect of this institutional exile. For years, William played the role of the protective older brother, a bond forged in the fires of shared tragedy and the shadow of their mother's memory. But that bond didn't just crack, it detonated. The betrayal William feels is not a family spat. It is a violation of trust so deep that it has rewritten the rules of the monarchy itself. Inside the palace, they say William's silence was his most powerful weapon, until the moment he decided that silence was no longer enough to protect the crown. The tension reached its breaking point during a series of private briefings, where William reportedly laid out a dossier of consequences to his father. He made it clear that allowing Harry a seat at the coronation would not be an act of mercy, but an act of weakness. William's logic was surgical. The monarchy is built on the foundation of duty and sacrifice, two things he believes Harry abandoned the moment he stepped onto that plane to California. For the future king, this isn't personal malice. It is institutional survival. He has watched his wife, Catherine, be dragged through a global spectacle of accusations, and he has vowed that she will never be a casualty of Harry and Meghan's media wars again. Sources close to the prince describe his tone during these meetings as immovable as stone. He reminded King Charles that the public's trust is fragile, and that the sight of a part-time royal claiming the honors of a system he publicly trashed would be an insult to every British citizen who pays for the institution. William isn't just protecting the present. He is guarding the future of his own children, George, Charlotte, and Louis. He refuses to let them inherit a battlefield where the crown is a target for anyone with a camera and a grudge. But there is a darker layer to this decision. Insiders whisper about a specific revelation, a moment where a private communication from Montecito crossed a line that William deemed unforgivable. While the details remain locked within the palace vaults, the effect was immediate. The king, torn between a father's ache and a monarch's duty, finally saw what William had seen for years. That reconciliation is impossible with someone who uses the family's private pain as currency for global fame. The final warning was issued not out of anger, but out of a cold necessity to stop the bleeding. The door isn't just locked. The locks have been changed. While the gates of London were being reinforced with ironclad protocols, across the Atlantic, a different kind of storm was brewing. Meghan Markle didn't just retreat after the initial fallout. She began a campaign of image restoration dressed as goodwill. There were no scorched earth interviews or staged media blitzes this time. Instead, what unfolded was a series of calculated appearances at charity galas and women's summits. Moves designed not to ask for forgiveness, but to command relevance. She was building her own monarchy in the court of global opinion, a shadow monarchy that threatened to rival the very institution she had left behind. Inside Kensington Palace, the red flags were raised immediately. Advisors watched as Meghan quietly rekindled ties with UK-based charities, praising British causes in global magazines and donating anonymously to London initiatives. To the casual observer, it looked like a woman finding her feet. To the palace, it looked like a woman reclaiming a stage she once walked away from on her own terms. Meghan wasn't waiting for an invitation to the coronation. She was repositioning herself so that her absence would be the only thing the world talked about. Then came the move that changed everything, the bold proposal. It arrived through back channels, worded with professional precision. Meghan Markle formally requested to rejoin select royal engagements. This wasn't a plea for reinstatement or a humble apology. It was a statement of intent. She proposed a collaboration. She would participate in events aligned with her global causes, mental health, youth empowerment, and women's rights, while remaining independent of palace control. It was a half-in, half-out model that the late Queen had already rejected, but Meghan was betting that a new king might be more desperate for a modern image. The reaction inside the palace was a mixture of disbelief and quiet outrage. For the senior royals, this was the ultimate audacity. Meghan wasn't asking to serve the crown. She was offering to use the crown to serve her brand. The proposal was seen as a calculated request for relevance, a way to keep the royal stardust without the royal restrictions. But what Meghan didn't realize was that her proposal didn't just trigger a diplomatic response. It triggered a reckoning. Catherine, the woman who had suffered the most from the Fab Four collapse, was the first to realize that if this door was opened even an inch, the monarchy as they knew it would be over. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force King Charles to choose between the son he loves and the survival of the throne itself. When Meghan's bold proposal reached the inner sanctum of the palace, it didn't just cause a stir. It hit a raw nerve that had been festering for years. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, was reportedly the first to break the heavy silence of the room. Her reaction wasn't one of theatrical drama, but of a quiet fury that left the room stunned. For Catherine, this wasn't about public image or charity alignment. It was about the emotional scars of strained events, icy silences, and the direct affronts she had endured during those final royal engagements. She made it clear, any return, even a limited one, would mean reopening wounds that had only just begun to form a fragile layer of healing. For Vua Charles III, the situation was a psychological minefield. He found himself torn between tradition and modernity, and more painfully, between the blood and duty. Charles is a man who has spent decades avoiding fires rather than fighting them, a monarch who prefers quiet negotiations to public ultimatums. He knew the global power of symbolism. Allowing Harry and Meghan back in some capacity could restore a veneer of international goodwill. But at what cost? He was inheriting a fractured family and a crumbling public trust, and he knew that every step he took toward Harry was a step away from William, his heir and his future. The king's dilemma was deepened by the pragmatic influence of Queen Camilla, who reportedly urged him to remain firm beside William. Her view was clinical. Meghan's return would only reignite controversy and undermine the massive effort the family had put into rebuilding their stability. She reminded Charles of the hardest lesson of the crown, that sometimes a king must choose the crown over the cradle. But the most devastating factor was the verdict delivered by Prince William himself. During the high-stakes meeting, William remained stone-faced and immovable. He didn't just argue against the proposal. He silenced the room with a single, chilling sentence. "This isn't about forgiveness. It's about consequence." With those words, the path for Charles was cleared. The heir had drawn the line, and the king realized that challenging his son now would fracture the monarchy from within. The decision was no longer about a family feud. It was a reckoning for the monarchy's soul. The final blow did not come in the form of a public shout or a dramatic press release, but in the quiet, lethal precision of a hand-delivered letter. Signed by the heir to the throne and bearing his personal crest, this was William's line in the sand. Inside the envelope was a message that effectively dismantled Meghan Markle's bid for re-entry, written in a language that insiders describe as unapologetically final. There was no room for interpretation and no olive branch for future discussion. This was the verdict of a future king who had decided that the integrity of the monarchy was worth more than a broken family bond. Beneath the veneer of royal civility, the letter was made of cold steel. William cited an irreparable breach of trust, making it clear that the palace now viewed Harry and Meghan's actions as an erosion of the institution itself. He didn't just deny the request. He framed it as a necessity for stability. Most chillingly, William invoked the legacy of Princess Diana, but not to seek sympathy. He wrote of preserving her memory through stability, not spectacle. A sharp jab at Harry's public use of their mother's trauma. William also positioned himself as a father, stating that his primary duty was guarding the next generation, George, Charlotte, and Louis, from the chaos that once destroyed his own. But the most personal line, the one that reportedly silenced the king's advisors, was his unwavering intent to protect Catherine from further emotional strain. He signaled that his wife would no longer be a casualty of palace politics, or a target for Harry's unresolved grievances. When Meghan received word of the stone-faced verdict, sources close to her say she was blindsided and devastated. She had anticipated resistance, but she had not anticipated finality. For a woman who had mastered the art of public narrative, this was a personal exile from any future reconciliation. The silence that followed the letter was deafening, but within the palace walls, it was seen as the only way to end the war. The crown had issued its judgment, and the door to the coronation was now officially slammed shut. The palace had intended for the verdict to remain a private matter, a final internal resolution to a generational crisis. But in the world of modern monarchy, silence is a luxury the crown can no longer afford. The letter, intended only for royal eyes, was leaked to the press, and the resulting explosion was felt across every time zone. Whether it was a calculated move by a palace faction or a deep betrayal from within, the result was a cultural war that could no longer be contained behind gilded gates. Headlines erupted globally. William shuts down Meghan. The final blow to royal unity. This wasn't just a family matter anymore. It became a global spectacle of power, race, and identity. Across Britain, the public response was immediate and sharply divided, cutting along ideological and generational lines. Royal loyalists hailed William's decision as principled and overdue, seeing him as the only guardian brave enough to enforce a standard of accountability. To them, he wasn't punishing a sister-in-law. He was protecting the sanctity of the coronation and the crown itself. However, for a younger, more global audience, the verdict felt like a cold and archaic act of exclusion. They didn't see a future king setting a boundary. They saw a brother slamming a door on his own flesh and blood. In America, the backlash was even more intense. Media outlets framed William as unyielding and vindictive, turning the royal rift into a primetime commentary on privilege and patriarchy. Celebrities and influencers ignited firestorms of opinion, painting Meghan as the perpetual outsider silenced by an unwelcoming system. Opinion polls began shifting in real time, showing a dip in support for the monarchy among younger voters while it climbed among the older generations. The monarchy had survived centuries of scandal, but few were prepared for this level of public rupture. Amidst this firestorm, Kensington Palace remained strategically silent, but Catherine's presence spoke for her. She appeared at a veterans' memorial, her composure reflecting a quiet dignity that analysts called a coded response to the chaos. She didn't need to speak to become a symbol of resilience in this war of narratives. But as the world debated his character, William knew that the battle was shifting from the halls of the palace to the court of global opinion. Neutrality was no longer an option, and the crown was now trapped in a reckoning that would redefine its survival in the 21st century. Just as the palace was settling into the belief that William's verdict had successfully contained the crisis, a storm was brewing across the Atlantic. Meghan Markle could have retreated. She could have stayed quiet in the face of such a high-level rejection. Instead, she chose to take the stage in New York, and what she said sent a clear message. She was far from done. This wasn't the appearance of a royal outcast, but of a woman reclaiming her voice on her own terms. The occasion was a high-profile women's summit, and Meghan delivered a keynote that struck like lightning. Without ever mentioning the monarchy by name, she spoke of duty without chains, and the courage it takes to speak your truth, even when it is unwelcome. Every word was calculated. Every pause was a statement. By the time she stepped away, she had received a full standing ovation, not just for her performance, but for her defiance against an institution that had just tried to silence her. Across social media, the narrative flipped instantly. Meghan was no longer being framed as the castaway. She was the disruptor, a royalty in exile, whose voice was now unchained. While some critics accused her of calculated vengeance, her supporters saw a woman carving out a crownless throne in the court of global opinion. She was proving that she didn't need a balcony in London to command global attention. This shift in power sent advisors at Buckingham Palace scrambling. They realized that with no protocol to restrain her and no allegiance to temper her words, Meghan had become a sovereign force in global storytelling. Whispers of a new, more personal memoir began to circulate, one that promised to be more piercing than anything before. The palace had closed the door to the coronation, but in doing so, they had inadvertently removed the last muzzle from their most vocal critic. The exile wasn't retreating. She was building an empire, and the real battle for the monarchy's legacy was only just beginning. For years, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, had been the crown's most reliable asset, loyal, composed, and seemingly unbreakable. She was the perfect royal, who never faltered under the weight of the cameras or the relentless pressure of public scrutiny. But behind that polished smile and those impeccable public appearances, a storm of buried pain had been building for years. The Fab Four era, once hailed as the future of the monarchy, had left her with emotional wounds that no amount of royal protocol could heal. In the stillness of a late night at Adelaide Cottage, the facade finally shattered. In a wave of trembling truth, Catherine broke her silence in a way that would haunt William forever. Her voice, usually so measured, cracked with the exhaustion of carrying the emotional cost of a war she never asked to be part of. She didn't speak with malice, but with a profound weariness that comes from years of wordless nods to dignity, while being used as a target in a global media battlefield. Catherine revealed a truth that William had never expected. She had once tried, quietly and away from the courtiers, to make peace with Meghan. She had reached out as a sister-in-law and a mother, extending a private olive branch when the world wasn't watching. But that gesture was met not with warmth, but with a cold silence that felt like a final blow to any hope of a united future. This rejection, she confessed, had been the moment she realized that the lie of reconciliation was breaking her. Her words to William were devastating. "You ended it for all of us." It wasn't just a critique of his political verdict, but an admission that the children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, were growing up in a world where their family was a battlefield. William stood frozen as the woman who had stood by him through everything finally admitted that the price of protecting the crown was the very peace of their own home. The stoic prince was left devastated, realizing that in his fight to save the institution, he might have overlooked the breaking heart of its most vital defender. As the echoes of Catherine's devastating confession faded into the night, Prince William was left in a silence more terrifying than any public accusation. He had spent his entire life building fortress-like walls around his family and the throne, but now he realized he was standing utterly alone within them. In the still, small hours of the morning, William was seen standing in one of the private galleries, frozen before a portrait of his mother, Princess Diana. He stared at her not as a prince or a future king, but as a son looking for guidance from the one voice he would never hear again. The question hanging in the cold air was deafening. What would she have done? William had invoked Diana's legacy in his punitive letter to Harry, claiming he was preserving her memory through stability rather than spectacle. But looking into his mother's eyes in the oil painting, he was forced to confront a brutal truth. Diana was a woman who prioritized emotion and love over the rigid codes of the court, was banning Harry, the son she had always worried for and loved with a fierce, protective intensity. Truly what she would have wanted. William's torment was not just about Harry. It was about the staggering price he had forced Catherine to pay. He had become the ultimate symbol of the system they once questioned together, and in that process, he had inadvertently turned his wife into a pawn in a power struggle she never sought. The fractures were no longer just between two brothers. They had begun to bleed into the very heart of the royal marriage deemed most perfect. William understood that the verdict to ban Harry from the coronation was an irreversible move. He had bet everything on institutional stability, yet the cost of that stability might be the permanent disintegration of his family. As dawn began to break over Windsor Castle, the prince realized that guarding the throne is a lonely vocation, where every politically right decision feels like a dagger to the most sacred personal bonds. The war for the monarchy's soul was only just beginning, and William was learning the hard way that he might save the crown, but lose his only brother forever. The day of the coronation arrived not with a sense of complete unity, but with a palpable, haunting silence where a son's presence should have been. As King Charles III felt the weight of St. Edward's crown on his head, the world wasn't just looking at the gold and jewels. They were looking at the empty seat that symbolized a family's ultimate failure. Prince William's final warning had been executed with surgical precision. Harry was gone, his name erased from the official liturgy, his shadow banished from the stone walls of Westminster Abbey. The crown had won the battle for stability, but the cost of that victory was written on the weary faces of the king and his heir. This verdict of stone has redefined the British monarchy for the 21st century. By choosing the institution over the individual, William has signaled that the future of the throne will be one of cold accountability rather than sentimental inclusion. The palace has successfully drawn a line in the sand, but across the Atlantic, Meghan Markle continues to build her own narrative, a sovereign force in global storytelling that no royal protocol can silence. The monarchy is no longer just navigating a family feud. It is trapped in a permanent cultural reckoning where every move is dissected by a world that no longer accepts never complain, never explain as a valid defense. Inside the palace, the cameras have stopped clicking, but the war for the monarchy's soul is far from over. Catherine, the silent symbol of royal resilience, continues to carry the emotional burden of a fractured legacy, while William prepares for a reign that will be defined by the hard boundaries he has set today. The ghost of Diana still lingers in the corridors, a reminder that a crown without a heart is just a hollow circlet of gold. King Charles III has his throne, but he has lost his youngest son. William has his stability, but he has lost his only brother. As the curtain falls on this chapter, one truth remains. The coronation was not the end, but the beginning of a much darker era. The final warning has been delivered, the doors are locked, and the exile is absolute. But in the shadows of history, the question remains. Can an institution survive by amputating its own flesh and blood, or has the crown just sown the seeds of its own eventual collapse? The world is watching, and the silence from Montecito is louder than any royal fanfare.